So how does dating violence start? There are all kinds of potential scenarios that might lead to an instance of dating violence in a romantic relationship. So today we're just going to talk about a few that psychology is aware of that might tend to lead to an instance of dating violence. And remember that this is correlational research, so just because one of these things occurs in the context of a dating relationship doesn't mean that it's going to lead to dating violence. It just means that it could be potentially associated with the start of dating violence. So some of these situations include mutual disagreement, escalating anger and escalating verbal arguments, emotional hurt and frustration, retaliation for some sort of verbal act or unfortunate event, and also just generally poor communication between individuals in the relationship. So all of these things might potentially trigger an instance of dating violence within a romantic relationship. But additionally, researchers have looked at patterns between couples that engage in dating violence tactics. So one of the patterns that has been found in research is this sort of idea that women who have experienced higher rates of psychological abuse, when asked to subsequently pick an additional partner, so after they've been in a psychologically abusive relationship, the partner that they choose after that relationship tends to be someone that engages in abusive tactics. So there's this finding that women that have experienced higher rates of psychological abuse subsequently will then choose partners that engage in abusive tactics. And relatedly, men who perpetrate psychological abuse tend to prefer women for dating partners that have insecure attachment styles. So if you remember from your developmental psych courses, that insecure attachment style might be something like anxious attachment or avoidant attachment. And so basically what that finding is saying is that men who perpetrate psychological abuse are going to be more attracted or prefer to pick partners to date that are more emotionally vulnerable. So we don't know exactly why those patterns exist at this point, but it's just one example of how dating violence might start in a romantic relationship. Certainly that finding needs some more research study in terms of why that pattern occurs. So for those of you that are interested, there's going to be lots of opportunities throughout this lecture and other lectures, potentially for additional research. So let's talk about victims of dating violence and what are some common characteristics of people that may have experienced dating violence in a romantic relationship. So most often we're seeing dating violence occurring in high school students or college-age populations, so sort of that younger age group developmentally. And again, that's typically because in those age groups, you're talking about unmarried, non-cohabitating individuals. Additionally, it also has to do a lot with convenience samples, right? So earlier on in the semester, we talked about how research often is limited by these samples of convenience. So people that are studying dating violence, they are more likely to have access to high school student participants and college-age student participants. So that's why we have a lot of data on dating violence within those populations. In terms of how age affects dating violence, right now research is suggesting that dating violence is inversely associated with age. So what that means is that the older that people get, DV tends to decrease. So younger people are at a higher risk for experiencing higher frequencies of dating violence than older people. In terms of gender, what we know so far from research is a little bit, unfortunately, confusing. So there's some research that suggests that dating violence is more commonly experienced by women than it is by men. But then we've also got a lot of research that suggests that dating violence is bidirectional. So what I mean by that is that both men and women engage in dating violence tactics. That also suggests that dating violence may be gender neutral to some extent. So some studies have looked at the severity of the actual behavior that the individuals engage in. So less severe tactics for dating violence are more likely to be perpetrated bidirectionally, so both people in the relationship. But the more severe that the tactic gets, the less likely that both partners are going to be engaging. So the more severe or the more violent the behavior becomes, the more likely that only one person in the relationship will be perpetrating those behaviors. Again, this is another area where more research needs to be done in order to sort of flesh out exactly how gender is affecting victims of dating violence or exactly what these findings might mean. But certainly, we do know a little bit in terms of gender. Other risk factors for dating violence, so other risk factors that might potentially be associated with experiencing dating violence. Alcohol use is probably one of the most common risk factors associated with dating violence. So either people being intoxicated or people using alcohol frequently is going to increase the risk that violence might occur within the dating relationship. When someone is intoxicated, it's much more likely that they'll become violent than if someone is not intoxicated. Additionally, thinking back to our learning theories and that idea of transgenerational transmission of violence, if an individual has experienced child abuse in their past or any form of child maltreatment, they're going to be at a higher risk for not only experiencing dating violence in a romantic relationship, but also in perpetrating violence in a romantic relationship. And the same thing goes for observing domestic violence between an individual's parents or caregivers in childhood. So if someone observes their parents or their caregivers experiencing violence in that romantic relationship, that's going to serve as sort of a model for how romantic relationships are supposed to be for that person. And they're much more likely to learn from that model and engage in those tactics as an adult or become a victim of those tactics as an adult. Certainly, other risk factors are going to include mental illness. So if mental illness exists for that person, they're going to be more at risk for experiencing dating violence within a relationship. Now let's switch topics to perpetrators. So what are some characteristics of perpetrators and risk factors for perpetrating dating violence? So what we know from research right now, and certainly, again, this is another area where more study would be helpful, but some commonly known characteristics of perpetrators of dating violence currently, we've got some demographic factors, so things like age and gender. So younger high school to college age males are more likely to perpetrate dating violence, so within that sort of 20 to 24 age range. But also we know a little bit about personality factors. So in looking at personality factors that are more likely to lead to the perpetration of dating violence, one of the biggest findings that we know from psychological research is that individuals that have both higher levels of state anger, so intense anger at the time of a particular event, and also higher levels of trait anger, so that would be just anger in general over a long period of time, or sort of reoccurring feelings of anger. If an individual has both of those two things, they're going to be more likely to perpetrate dating violence tactics. Some other interesting personality traits that are more likely to lead to perpetration of dating violence. If an individual subscribes to the idea of hypermasculinity, so hypermasculinity is sort of this exaggeration of male stereotypical behavior with an emphasis on physical strength, aggression, and hypersexuality. So if someone has high levels of hypermasculinity, they're going to be more likely to engage in dating violence tactics. Additionally, if someone has a high need for controlling other people, whether that's in a romantic sense or in friendships or whatever the case may be, they're going to be more likely to engage in dating violence. That might also correspond to feelings of jealousy and needing to control people out of that feeling of jealousy. Whatever the case may be, if there's that desire and need to control others, that's going to put them at an increased risk for perpetrating. Some interesting findings in terms of gender and perpetration of dating violence. So with perpetrating dating violence, men are more likely to perpetrate. However, women tend to perpetrate dating violence, most likely in scenarios where they're trying to defend themselves. So there was an interesting study that looked at self-reporting, how often they engaged in dating violence for both men and women. And so when women reported how often they initiated dating violence tactics, they said that they perpetrated about 27% of the time. So about 30% of the time. And they said that men initiated dating violence tactics about 70% of the time. The interesting part of this study is that when men were asked to report on how often women and men perpetrated, Men also said that women perpetrated about 30% of the time and that men perpetrated about 70% of the time. So we saw a pretty high concordance rate between what men and women were reporting, which doesn't often happen in psychological research, but it was just interesting to see that this sort of pattern existed.